Okay, let's look at the basic concept of the portfolio management. The main intention of getting into a portfolio is to club two or more securities, right? And the intention is it should reduce my risk, because if I put all my investment in one single security, if it goes up like anything. If it goes down, the value of it, I lose everything. So I'm planning my investment in such a way that I put some portion in different set of securities, so that even if one security falls down in value, the other may not fall by that extent, and overall there may be a kind of balancing to my loss. So the intention of the portfolio management is never to make profits, but primarily for risk reduction. So you may not get exceptional profit which you will get when you invest in one single security, because it's like you are taking a risk. If it gives you, it will give you like anything. If you lose, you will lose like anything. So that much of return you will never get when you go with a portfolio, because portfolio's intention, though you compromise on the return to a little extent, but the risk is drastically reduced. So you need to plan your investments in such a way. Look at the way these two are moving. See, probably if I take two securities A and B, their general behavior may be like, if on a day when A is going up in its price, probably B may be going down. For example, in general, a gold market versus a stock market. There is a general tendency that when the stock markets are typically going down, the gold prices may pick up, and vice versa. Now, so even if I invest completely in stock market, the day I gain, I'll gain heavily. The day I lose, I'll lose heavily. Same thing with only gold. If I put in gold, the day I gain, I'll gain heavily. The day I lose, I'll lose heavily. But if I combine my investment in such a way that 50% I put, or some percentage I put in gold and some percentage in the stock market, it can very well happen that if I gain, I may not gain to that exceptional extent, because if one goes up, the other is going down. If I know that is a kind of a relationship between the two, if the stock market is going up, probably the gold is going down, and vice versa. My gain overall may not be that great, but at the same time, my loss also will not be that extensive whenever I lose, because even if one market is falling drastically, the other may slightly go up, which will reduce my overall loss. So the intention of getting into a portfolio is completely into a risk reduction strategy. So as a part of this, again, a few English statements also go well here. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, and these kind of statements, they are a true reflection to the world of portfolio. So there are few calculations that are there with respect to the portfolio. For example, let's assume that we are choosing two securities, A and B. Individually, A is giving a return of R1 and B is giving a return of R2. When I combine them into a portfolio, which means I am putting some investment, some W1 in this, so the some W2 in this. So this W2 is nothing but 1 minus W1, because I am only investing in two securities only. So as per the fundamentals of the portfolio management, the return of the portfolio will simply go as the weighted average of the individual returns, W1 R1 plus W2 R2. Whereas the risk is measured in terms of standard deviation, sigma. So let's assume that each of these A and B individually have the standard deviations of sigma 1 and sigma 2. When I combine them, which means their variances are sigma 1 squared and sigma 2 squared. When I combine them into a portfolio, the typical relationship goes as W1 squared sigma 1 squared plus W2 squared sigma 2 squared plus 2W1 W2 covariance between the two securities A and B. What it is simply saying is, this actually is nothing but the variance it's a statistical equation talking on the variance of two securities W1A plus W2B goes, the expansion of this is nothing but W1 squared variance of A plus W2 squared variance of B, and between the relationship between A and B also it depends. That relationship between A and B is measured in terms of covariance. And covariance in a way, again going with a slight expansion in the relation, it goes as correlation between A and B multiplied by the standard deviation of A and standard deviation of B. That is where we define the covariance. Covariance as a word is, it's again a variance, but not with itself, but with some other security. So how A is varying when B is changing. If B is going up, is A going up or going down consistently? And vice versa. If B is going down, is A going up or going down? That is what is the measure through the covariance. So it's also a variance. Variance is with respect to some average of that own security, how much is the fluctuation. Whereas when we talk about covariance, we look at it with respect to some other security always. So this is the equation that goes. So because of this, depending on the covariance between the two securities A and B, you would see that the overall variance of the portfolio can either be very high or very low. So if I very well say that the covariance is a negative quantity, which means if one security is going up, the other is going down. If they are behaving in that mechanism, we will always see that the covariance is negative. So when the covariance is negative, we will see that this term is a negative term, because the weightages cannot be negative, covariance is negative. So this entire term is becoming a negative term. Because of that, the variance of the portfolio can come down drastically. So that is the intention behind the portfolio management. When I combine two securities, if I choose them in such a way that the covariance between them comes down. Covariance comes down is nothing but both of them are oppositely related, or both of them are almost unrelated. It's not that both of them are moving exactly in the same direction. If they are moving, both of them are moving in the same direction. Let's say the day on which Infosys price goes up, even the Wipro price goes up. Let's say if that is the kind of scenario that is there, they don't form a good portfolio. Because the day when they both go up, I'll get good profits. But the day when they both fall, because both move together, so when they both fall, I'm losing heavily. The intention is to reduce that loss. So I should choose those securities in such a way that they move in the opposite direction. So that is what is measured through the covariance. So once we put this into the equation, we can see how effective we can get the relation using the portfolio. The more and more, or the less and less correlated are the two securities, we see that we can form a very effective portfolio using them. Right? We'll see a few examples here. Let's say I have taken three securities: Infosys, ICICI Bank and Reliance Industries. I would like to find out, here I make one blind assumption, last one year data I have taken. So whatever the return they have given in the last 1 year, I'll assume that they'll give the same return in the next 1 year. I mean, again, though may or may not, or we can take some number associated with the returns for the next year. So just to create a portfolio, I would like to create a portfolio between Infosys and ICICI Bank, or Infosys and RIL kind of combination. We'll see which of them will end up as an effective combination. Okay, so here I'll find out the returns. I'll find out the returns of Infosys I'll find out the returns of ICICI Bank, and I'll also find out the returns of RIL. Again, just like a simple return process, I'll find it as today's price minus the yesterday's price divided by the yesterday's price. This is what I'm calling as the return of this security. Similarly, I'm doing the same exercise. Okay, so for the three securities, I have the return. So as going with this panda, I require the average returns of both these securities. So I'll take annual numbers only, not the daily. Annual numbers, return of Infosys, I'll take it as the average of this. This gives me the daily. I multiply it with 250 to give me the average annual return of this security. Then similarly, I take for the ICICI Bank, I'll take the average return. This is a daily return, so I'll multiply it with 250. So it is giving, if it has fallen more drastically. And when I look at the way the Reliance has moved, okay, this also I have to multiply by 250. Okay, Reliance has fallen by 24% almost in the last 1 year. The similarly, probably the Nifty also, if I take, okay, Nifty has fallen, returns of Nifty. Okay, Nifty has just fallen by around 7%, whatever. So let me assume that these are the returns even for the future. You can take any numbers, no issues. What is typically important for us is finding out their variances of each of them and the standard deviations of each of them. Okay, we'll take it directly in terms of the standard deviations. So individually, if I had invested, right, this is an important aspect here. Individually, if I would want to invest in Infosys, the variance, see, this is the standard deviation, but this is a daily standard deviation. So if I want to find out the annual standard deviation, I'll multiply it with square root of 250, because for variance I'll multiply it with 250. So for standard deviation I'll multiply with square root of 250. So this ends up as the standard deviation of Infosys daily. The same way we can look at standard deviation of ICICI Bank. Yeah, more riskier. And standard deviation of RIL during the same period. Alright, slightly less risky. And same thing with Nifty. Okay, so this is how the standard deviations of these four are there. Now let's say I would combine them. I want to combine, let's say, Infosys and ICICI Bank. I would like to combine the Infosys and ICICI Bank. or in this case, we are seeing more risky, but more less risky, but more return, more better return, right? Whereas we see here, this is more risky and less return. Actually, more risky should give me more return and vice versa. That is where it can give me. Okay, then we'll see. We'll find in some combination. We'll do it with ICICI Bank and RIL, right? Because here ICICI Bank is more risky and is giving more returns compared to RIL. So that forms into a decent portfolio. Or probably we should look at Infosys and Nifty. Less risky, less returns. So we'll look at ICICI Bank and RIL. Now, if I say I will create a portfolio between ICICI Bank and RIL. So I would need to see in what proportion I need to invest there. So that for that portfolio, I would like to find out what is the kind of combination that will pull down my risk but will not compromise on the return, or slight compromise on the return but will pull down my risk drastically. So to do that, I'll even get into the covariance between all these combinations. So for time being, we'll go with ICICI Bank and RIL, right? So I will try to find out the covariance between the two. So the covariance between ICICI Bank returns and RIL returns is positive itself. This is a daily covariance. So I'll multiply it with 250 to get the annual covariance. So this is the number corresponding to the covariance. And also I'll try to find out the correlation between ICICI Bank and RIL. So correlation between ICICI Bank and RIL. This will clearly tell me, okay, you see, it is only 0.57. If it is, see, correlation always lies between +1 and -1. The value, the more the value is closer to +1, we can very well say that it's not good to form a portfolio. They are not good enough to form a portfolio. Probably if we see between the other correlation between Infosys and ICICI Bank, we can see, okay, Infosys and ICICI Bank, it is 0.47. These two are even more better for a portfolio. But the point is, we'll see it through the diagram also. If at all the correlation between these two is almost zero or negative, they are very good to form a portfolio. Whereas if it is more and more positive, it's not that good to form a portfolio. Now, just to make things even more better, what I'll try to take is, I'll just change these numbers a little bit because all of them are giving negative return. I'll simply take the negative of them so that it becomes positive returns, 10% and something like this, right? I'll take just the negative of them so that we can do our calculation much better and we can understand the portfolios much better. Okay, here we can very well see, and that is the case, ICICI Bank is having more risk and it is giving me more return. Infosys is having slightly comparatively lesser risk and it gives me slightly lesser return, right? So I'll even find out the covariance between Infosys and ICICI Bank. Okay, these are the numbers. This is again on a daily basis, so multiply it to form the annual. Okay. Now let's say I want to try out some combinations of ICICI Bank and Infosys. So I'll try out a few combinations. The Infosys is this much and ICICI Bank is this much. So I'll try to put like 0%, 10%. I want to see different combinations. Right? In what should be a better combination for me to invest? If at all I have to decide between Infosys and ICICI Bank, only two investments, what is my better combination? Is it like I should invest everything in Infosys or everything in ICICI Bank or some combination? See, if I invest everything in Infosys, I'll just get 10% return with some amount of, with a lesser risk. If I invest everything in ICICI Bank, I may get 18% return, but probably I have to take more risk. I may lose also heavily. So, less risk, less return, more risk, more return, two securities. Now, is there any better off way somewhere in the middle, let's say 60-40, 70-30, some kind of a combination, where my overall risk, can it come down below 30 first of all? See here, if I just look at these two, my overall risk is 30%. Can I do it in such a way that my overall risk can even come below 30? That is what we are trying to go with when we are doing this portfolio analysis. Now, let's say if I am combining these two in this kind of a proportion, I will try to see what is the return of the portfolio and what is the standard deviation of the portfolio in each of these combinations, going with that formula W1 R1 plus W2 R2. So this is W1 R1 plus W2 R2. So this is giving me, so because if I put all 100% in ICICI Bank, I'll get the same return as ICICI Bank's return itself. And over a process, this is what? So 10, 11, if I put 100% in Infosys, it will give me the entire return of Infosys itself. Now, what is happening to the risk? Going with that formula, sigma 1, W1 squared, sigma 1 squared plus W2 squared, sigma 2 squared plus 2W1, W2 covariance between these two. Alright. So now I'll see, so because I need the standard deviation, I am directly taking the square root because it will give me the variance. The formula is giving me, this is the variance formula. So I take the square root, I will get the standard deviation. Okay, W1 squared sigma 1 squared plus W2 squared W2 squared sigma 2 squared plus 2 W1 W2, the covariance between ICICI Bank and Infosys. This is the covariance between the ICICI Bank and or I should take correlation multiplied by the standard deviation of ICICI Bank into the standard deviation of Infosys, like this expansion. Instead of covariance, I can very well go with the correlation multiplied by these. Okay, covariance of this. Alright, so it is saying if I put 100%, my standard deviation is same as the standard deviation of ICICI Bank itself. But because of the combination now, you see, there are a few combinations where the overall risk has gone lesser than individual risk. That is the reason why we go for a portfolio. Right? I can reduce the risk as a simple point here with a portfolio. If I have to make one simple statement regarding a portfolio, I can say reduce risk below the least individual risk, but return between the maximum and minimum only. If you see here, the return was, all these returns are lying between these two returns only. Whereas the risks are not lying between the two. The risk has come below the minimum value. So as a simple logic, okay, let me take this low combination, the least combination. Let's say this is a combination which is showing me the least possible risk. So if I look at this combination and compare it with the investment of Infosys alone. So I want to compare investment in Infosys alone versus this combination. The risk of Infosys alone is higher than the combination. Whereas the return of Infosys alone is lesser than the combination. So if I am taking high risk, it should give me high return. Whereas Infosys alone is not giving me that kind of a return. The combination is giving me more return for a lesser risk. So directly this combination is gaining a win over the Infosys alone kind of an investment. So that is how the portfolio will typically create its own impact compared to the individual security investment. So for this purpose, what is typically looked at is, we look at what we typically call as the efficient risk frontier. So with this as information, we will create efficient risk frontier, which is nothing but, I'll try to do a graph plotting between the standard deviation on the x-axis and the returns on the y-axis. Right? We'll see the way the graph comes out. That is what we call as the efficient frontier graph. I'll plot a graph where I'm taking these values on the x-axis and these values on the y-axis. You see, this is the graph that gets generated. This is the typical graph relating to the efficient risk frontier. Now, what we are observing here in this graph is, for different values of risk, you are having different returns. But there are some areas of risk. Let's say in this range, there are some areas of risk for which you have two different returns. Probably let's say at around 0.31 or something, there is one return here, there is one return here. There are two returns possible. Now, any commonsensical investor will always choose the one that is giving a higher return for a particular amount of risk, right? So, which means all these portfolios which are there, which are downward sloping, they are all called as inefficient portfolios, which even includes a 0-100 investment. All these which are in the downward side are called as inefficient portfolios, and all these which are on the higher side, we are calling them as the efficient portfolios. So depending on the risk the person is willing to take, the individual 0.3, 0.31, depending on the risk taking potential of that individual, we will choose these kind of combinations. In a way, what we typically observe is, okay, let's say someone is willing to take a risk equivalent to some 30 point something. Almost there are two solutions for that 30 point. Just a very minor difference. But obviously this is giving only 10% return, but here I'll get 16% return. So obviously the combination, this is much better compared to this. So this is losing out to this combination. So like that, what happens is only the area which is on the upward sloping segment, that is what we are calling as the efficient risk frontier. And the other logic that says is there is a minimum value that is possible. Right? So for probably some amount of risk, probably somewhere between 0.25 and 0.3, there is a possibility where the risk is coming out to the minimum possible, which is lesser than each of the individual risks. So that typical location is what we call as the global minimum variance frontier. Global minimum variance frontier for the combination of Infosys and ICICI Bank. Now here we'll just change a few values to observe this situation slightly better. Now let's say to see the impact of how correlation impacts, right? So in my calculations here, just to make the things slightly more better, what I'll take is, in this calculation, instead of taking covariance directly, I'll take correlation multiplied by the standard deviations. Just because I want to change the correlation and see the graphs. Correlation multiplied by the standard deviation of the first one multiplied by the standard deviation of the second one. You'll get the same numbers. But the only thing is, now I'll have a possibility to change these values. Okay, here, now the graph is still looking like this itself. Now what I'll do is, I'll change the correlation here manually. This is what we got by doing a calculation. But let me assume that the correlation between the two securities is -1. Which is the least possible, which means both are actually going every day in the opposite direction. The day Infosys price goes up by 1%, ICICI Bank falls by 1%, and exactly like that. Then only we have the correlation of -1. You see, if that is the case, my graph comes more like this, which means my risk has come almost close to 0. Just above 0, but probably if I manage my combinations in such a way that it can even go to 0 also, which is more like an arbitrage kind of a scenario. I can even minimize my risk altogether if I choose two securities which have a correlation of -1 between them. So you see that the graph is more curvy, whereas the same way if the correlation is +1, both are moving exactly in the same direction, there is no scope for a portfolio at all. There is no scope, because as the risk is, you don't see kind of inefficient areas. There is no scope for a portfolio creation at all, because the lesser the risk, the lesser is the return, and the higher, as the risk is increasing, the return is increasing. You don't have a curve at all when the two securities are having a correlation of 1 between them, and a 0, it's again a curvy. So the correlation typically exists, or depending on the correlation between the two securities, we typically observe that the graphs keep changing, which means I can very well create a portfolio, a very good portfolio, if at all the correlation between the two securities which I am choosing is much lesser. That is one of the important fundamentals in terms of the creation of the portfolio. I need to choose two or more securities in such a way that the correlation between them is either 0 or negative, or even if it is positive, very close around 0 but not close to 1, so that that combination will not compromise on the return that much, but it will compromise, it will bring down your risk drastically, and it can even take your risk below the minimum most value of the individual securities. That is the intention of creating a portfolio. And here people generally even look at another measure called Sharpe ratio, which is nothing but your securities return or a portfolio's return minus the risk-free rate of return divided by the standard deviation of your portfolio. Now, if we see the Sharpe ratio in all these cases, the return of the security or the portfolio minus, okay, risk-free rate of return, let's assume it at around 8%, any number you take, divided by the standard deviation of the portfolio. The Sharpe ratio is this much, whereas as it moves 29, 29, we are seeing that as we move, the Sharpe ratio is either falling or going up. Now, I want to choose some kind of a combination where my Sharpe ratio also is typically going up. The combination where my Sharpe ratio goes up is also a value for money kind of a combination. In some cases, it may not come up, it may not go down that drastically. It is just going down in all the cases. But let's say if the correlation between them is 0, here you see a different way in which the Sharpe is moving. It is increasing, 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 and then decreasing. So my intention always are to either minimize the risk altogether, which means I don't want to take any kind of a risk, or when I look at the Sharpe ratio, it means I am ready to take a risk, provided it gives me the better returns. That is what the Sharpe ratio is measuring. So if I go with the Sharpe ratio funda, probably my intention or my investment would be in this combination. Whereas if I am looking at pure risk mitigation fundamental, my combination would be this one. So again, you will find two different sets of investors. One who don't want to take a risk at all, even if it is a compromise on the return. The other set of individuals are ready to take a risk, provided they are getting bigger returns for whatever the risk they are taking. So for them, you measure it based on the Sharpe ratio. Whereas for the others, someone who does not want to take any risk, again that is based on the investor's psychology. Someone who does not want to take any risk, probably a very old person or kind of behavior, you suggest the least risk possible kind of a security for them. And if at all someone is willing to take a risk, but only if it gives them better returns, you are suggesting the security which is having a better Sharpe ratio. Right? So this is when you are combining two or more securities without, two or more securities which are risky itself. This entire portfolio, whatever we are talking of, is a risky portfolio. We have not brought in the concept of any risk-free investment. But generally, any person, he will definitely have some proportion of the money in the risk-free and some proportion in the risky. Even any one of us, right? Even if you invest heavily in the stock market, you will have some amount in the bank deposit also. Everyone for that matter will have bank deposit as a minimum stuff, because that is more considered to be risk-free kind of a security. So if I combine the risk-free with the risky, you will definitely see some other kind of a combination in the graph. But as long as we are discussing only the risky securities, right? So we are talking of two or more risky securities. Now if it is more, the formula remains the same. The return on the portfolio will go as W1R1 plus W2R2 plus W3R3. Whereas the variance, same, W1 squared sigma 1 squared, W2 squared sigma 2 squared, W3 squared sigma 3 squared. And here it goes as pairwise. 2W1 W2 covariance between A and B. 2W2 W3 covariance between B and C. 2W1 W3 covariance between A and C. So the more the number of securities are going up, actually the equation is becoming longer and longer, and the number of terms in the equation is going very large. So that's where again using some kind of system based tools and probably in Excel using some kind of features like solvers and all, they help us in terms of creating this entire impact with the least possible combination, because at the end it's just not, probably here we have taken only 10 combinations, 0, 100, 10, 90, but probably the combination would have been 63, 37 at 62.25 and 37.75. That would give me the least possible risk. So it cannot be manually possible doing a few of the stuff. So that's where some kind of computer algorithms and all can solve this purpose. But conceptually, any number of securities that are there, when I talk about the portfolio, the intention is to reduce the risk on the portfolio as an initial step, right? And that risk reduction is measured through the standard deviation or the variance, and the variance in turn is dependent on the correlation or the covariance of the security, and by combining them in some proportion I can very well reduce the risk of the portfolio, right?